He faked his death to expose his children's true colors, and what he was shocked him. The day Marcus Okonkwo supposedly died, his eldest son was already calculating the value of the estate. His daughter was rehearsing her funeral tears in front of a mirror. And his youngest son was booking a flight home, not out of grief, but out of fear that he might miss his share of the fortune. But Marcus Okonkwo wasn't dead. Not even close. The 72-year-old business tycoon lay perfectly still in his mahogany study, watching through barely opened eyelids as his personal physician delivered the fabricated news to his family. The doctor, bound by a private agreement and a substantial payment, played his role with convincing sorrow. The family's reactions, however, would prove far more theatrical than any performance the old man could have imagined. What Marcus witnessed in the hours, days, and weeks following his staged death would shatter every illusion he had carefully constructed about his children over the decades. The inheritance he had built through sweat, sacrifice, and sleepless nights was about to become a battlefield, and the casualties would be measured not in money, but in the complete destruction of familial bonds. Marcus had not arrived at this desperate plan overnight. For months, he had noticed the subtle shifts in his children's behavior. The phone calls that came only when they needed money. The visits that felt more like business meetings than family gatherings. The way their eyes would glaze over when he spoke about anything other than his will. He had built an empire worth over $200 million, starting from nothing but a small transport business with 2 aging vehicles. He had survived military coups, economic recessions, and cutthroat competitors. But he had never felt more alone than in the vast mansion surrounded by children who seemed to view him as nothing more than a walking inheritance. The idea came to him during one particularly hollow family dinner. His 3 children sat around the imported Italian dining table, their phones buzzing with messages, their minds clearly elsewhere. They had come because he had summoned them, promising an important announcement about his estate planning. The announcement never came. Instead, Marcus studied them throughout the meal, seeing them perhaps for the first time without the rose-tinted glasses of parental love. What he saw disturbed him deeply enough to conceive of the most elaborate test any father could devise. His eldest son, Chidi, was 43 years old and had been groomed since birth to take over the family business. Marcus had sent him to the finest schools in England, paid for his MBA at Harvard, and handed him an executive position in the company before he turned 30. Chidi wore expensive suits, drove a Mercedes-Benz that cost more than most houses, and spoke with the polished accent of someone who had spent too much time trying to forget where he came from. He had married a woman from a prominent political family, more for connections than love, and they had produced 2 children who called their grandfather Sir instead of something warmer. Chidi's ambition was naked and unapologetic. He had been waiting for his father to die for years, though he would never admit it out loud. The daughter, Adana, was 38 and had always been Marcus's favorite, though he would deny it if asked. She had her mother's face, and perhaps that was why he had indulged her more than the others. Adana had studied law but never practiced, instead becoming what she called a social entrepreneur, which seemed to involve attending charity galas and posting pictures on social media. She had been married twice, both times to men who were more interested in her family's wealth than in her. Marcus had paid for both weddings and both divorces, never once hearing a genuine thank you. Adana lived in a luxury apartment in the city's most exclusive neighborhood, drove a Range Rover, and maintained a lifestyle that required a monthly allowance that could feed a small village for a year. The youngest, Obinna, was 32 and had always been the rebel. He had dropped out of university, much to Marcus's fury, and had spent his 20s traveling the world on his father's money, claiming to be finding himself. What he had found, apparently, was a series of failed business ventures, expensive addictions, and a talent for asking for money. Obinna was charming when he wanted something, cold when he didn't get it. He had never held a job for more than 6 months, never paid his own rent, and never once acknowledged the privilege that cushioned his every failure. These were Marcus's children. These were the people who would inherit everything he had built. The thought kept him awake at night, until finally, he decided to do something about it. The plan required careful orchestration. Marcus contacted his oldest friend, a retired judge named Emeka, and confided his intentions. Emeka thought he was mad at first, but Marcus was persuasive. He arranged for a secret location, a modest apartment in a middle-class neighborhood where no one would think to look for him. He enlisted his physician, his lawyer, and his most trusted business manager, each sworn to absolute secrecy under threat of legal action. He drafted a new will, one that would only be revealed after his resurrection, and he prepared himself mentally for what he might discover. The staged death occurred on a Wednesday morning. Marcus had complained of chest pains the night before, a detail his children would later recall with what they would claim was concern. The doctor arrived at dawn, spent 30 minutes in Marcus's bedroom, and emerged with the grave news. Marcus Okonkwo had suffered a massive heart attack. He was gone. What followed was a masterclass in human selfishness. Chidi arrived first, having been called by the doctor. He spent exactly 4 minutes in the room with his father's body before leaving to make phone calls. The calls were not to family friends or relatives. They were to lawyers, accountants, and business associates. Within an hour, Chidi was in his father's study, searching through files, checking documents, making lists. He was looking for the will, for bank account information, for anything that would give him an advantage in what he already saw as an inevitable battle with his siblings. From his hidden position behind a two-way mirror installed in the study wall, Marcus watched his son's every move. The old man's heart, which had not actually failed, felt like it might actually break. There were no tears on Chidi's face. No moment of grief or reflection. Just cold, calculated efficiency as he photographed documents with his phone and sent them to his personal lawyer. Adana arrived 2 hours later, her entrance far more dramatic. She wailed loudly enough for the neighbors to hear, threw herself across her father's bed, and declared that she couldn't possibly go on. The performance lasted approximately 15 minutes. Then, as if someone had flipped a switch, the tears stopped. She sat up, composed herself, and began asking about funeral arrangements. Specifically, she wanted to know who would be paying for them, and whether there was a budget. When the doctor mentioned that Marcus had left instructions for a simple ceremony, Adana's face twisted with disgust. Simple wouldn't do. People expected grandeur from the Okonkwo family. What would society say if they buried Marcus like some common man? She immediately began planning an elaborate funeral that would cost over 3 million naira, all to be charged to the estate. Obinna didn't arrive until the next day. His flight from Dubai, where he had been partying on his father's credit card, had been delayed. He showed up unshaven, hungover, and clearly inconvenienced. His condolences were perfunctory, delivered between yawns. But his interest sharpened considerably when Adana mentioned that she hadn't been able to find a copy of the will. Obinna suggested that perhaps their father had hidden it, or worse, had been planning to change it. This sparked the first real conversation the three siblings had engaged in together in years. It was not about their father's life, his achievements, or their memories of him. It was about money. Marcus listened from the adjacent room as his children speculated about their inheritance. Chidi insisted that as the eldest son and the one who worked in the business, he deserved the lion's share. Adana argued that their father had always favored her, and besides, as the only daughter, tradition demanded she receive a substantial portion. Obinna, perhaps more honest than his siblings, simply stated that he needed money more than either of them, therefore he should receive more. The argument escalated quickly, voices rising until they were shouting at each other in the same room where their father's body supposedly lay. The funeral was scheduled for 2 weeks later, following traditional customs. During those 2 weeks, Marcus observed his children from various hidden vantage points, aided by the small network of loyal servants who were in on the secret. What he witnessed systematically destroyed every positive feeling he had ever harbored toward them. Chidi used the time to consolidate power within the family business. He called emergency board meetings, positioned himself as the natural successor, and began making decisions as if he already owned the company. He fired 3 long-serving employees who had been loyal to Marcus, replacing them with his own people. He also began an affair with his father's young secretary, a woman Marcus had mentored and considered like a daughter. The betrayal was casual, opportunistic, and cruel. Adana transformed the funeral into a social circus. She hired the most expensive event planners in the city, demanded that the ceremony be held at the largest cathedral, and invited everyone who was anyone, regardless of whether they had known Marcus. She gave interviews to newspapers and magazines, positioning herself as the grieving daughter while wearing designer mourning clothes that cost more than most people earned in a year. She also began a whisper campaign against her brothers, suggesting to family members that neither Chidi nor Obinna had truly loved their father, that only she had been the devoted child. The lies came so easily to her that Marcus wondered if she even recognized them as lies anymore. Obinna's behavior was perhaps the most disturbing because it was the most honest. He made no pretense of grief. Instead, he moved into the mansion and began living like he already owned it. He threw parties, invited his questionable friends, and treated the staff like servants in his personal palace. He also began stealing, small items at first, then larger ones. Watches, cufflinks, valuable books from Marcus's collection. He was selling them online, generating cash for his immediate needs because he couldn't access the estate accounts yet. When confronted by the house manager, Obinna claimed that these items were his to take, that his father would have wanted him to have them. But the worst was yet to come. The will reading was scheduled for the day after the funeral. Marcus's lawyer, who was party to the deception, had prepared a fake will that would be read to the family. This will divided the estate into 3 equal parts, with some conditions attached. Each child would receive their inheritance only after completing certain tasks that demonstrated responsibility, charity, and family loyalty. The conditions were not onerous, just enough to test their character one final time. The funeral itself was a spectacle that Marcus watched from a car parked far from the cathedral. Thousands attended, many of them strangers drawn by curiosity or the promise of elaborate catering. Adana had indeed spared no expense. There were multiple choirs, imported flowers, and a program that listed every one of Marcus's achievements as if they were her own accomplishments. The 3 children sat in the front row, dressed in matching traditional mourning attire that had been custom-made at enormous cost. They looked appropriately somber, but Marcus could see through them now. Chidi kept checking his phone. Adana kept adjusting her makeup for the photographers. Obinna looked bored. The eulogies were hollow. Chidi spoke about his father's business acumen but made it sound like he was really talking about himself, about how he had learned from the best and would carry on the legacy. Adana spoke about her father's love for family, choking back tears that never actually fell, while describing incidents that had never happened. Obinna mercifully kept his speech short, thanking everyone for coming and suggesting they all move to the reception where, he joked, his father would want them to celebrate rather than mourn. The joke fell flat. After the funeral, after the burial at the expensive cemetery plot that Adana had insisted upon, the family gathered for the will reading. The lawyer's office was crowded with the 3 children, their spouses, several cousins, and various hangers-on who hoped to be mentioned in the will. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for. The lawyer opened the document with appropriate solemnity and began to read. As he outlined the equal division of assets, Marcus watched through a carefully positioned camera feed from his hidden apartment. He saw Chidi's face darken with anger. Equal shares? After all he had done for the company? Adana looked equally displeased. She had expected more, had already spent money based on assumptions of what she would inherit. Obinna was the only one who seemed satisfied, probably because he had expected to be cut out entirely. Then the lawyer read the conditions. Chidi would receive his inheritance only after he had worked without salary for 6 months at the company's lowest level position, learning the business from the ground up as his father had done. Adana would receive hers after she had spent 6 months volunteering at a charity, actually working rather than just attending galas. Obinna would receive his after 6 months of steady employment at any legitimate job, paid for by his own efforts without family connections. The room erupted. Chidi called it an insult, a manipulation from beyond the grave. How dare his father treat him like some entry-level nobody? He had an MBA from Harvard. Adana declared the conditions impossible. 6 months of actual work. She had a lifestyle to maintain. What would people think? Obinna laughed bitterly and said what they were all thinking. The old man had found a way to control them even in death. He refused to play along. They all refused. Within 24 hours, all 3 children had hired lawyers to contest the will. They argued that their father had not been of sound mind when he drafted it, that he had been unduly influenced, that the conditions were unreasonable and unenforceable. They banded together for the first time in years, united not by love or grief, but by their mutual resentment of their father's final wishes. The lawsuits they filed would have tied up the estate for years, costing millions in legal fees, destroying the business, and ultimately leaving everyone with far less than they would have received if they had simply accepted the terms. Marcus had seen enough. The test was complete, and his children had failed spectacularly. Not one of them had mourned him genuinely. Not one had honored his memory. Not one had shown even a shred of the character he had hoped to instill in them. They were strangers to him now, strangers who happened to share his blood and his name, but nothing else. On the morning of what would have been his 1-month death anniversary, Marcus Okonkwo walked into the lawyer's office where his children had gathered for yet another meeting about contesting the will. The secretary tried to stop him, part of the plan, creating enough commotion that the conference room door opened and Chidi stepped out to see what was happening. The color drained from his face. For a moment, he looked like he might faint. He made a sound, something between a gasp and a cry, and stumbled backward. Adana appeared next, drawn by her brother's reaction. She screamed, a genuine scream this time, nothing theatrical about it. Obinna emerged last, took one look at his father, and said a word that would have earned him a slap if Marcus were feeling charitable enough to touch him. Marcus stood in the doorway, very much alive, and looked at his 3 children with eyes that held no warmth, no forgiveness, only a deep and abiding disappointment. He was dressed in the same traditional outfit he had worn to important business meetings, his posture straight despite his age, his presence commanding the room as it always had. The explanation took hours. Marcus detailed everything he had witnessed. He had recordings, photographs, witness statements from the loyal servants who had helped him maintain the deception. He had documented every betrayal, every selfish act, every moment that revealed his children's true nature. As he spoke, Chidi's face went from shock to anger to something that might have been shame, though it was hard to tell. Adana cried real tears for the first time, but they were tears of humiliation, not remorse. Obinna simply sat there, perhaps realizing that he had never bothered to pretend to be anything other than what he was, and finding no reason to start now. When Marcus finished, the room was silent. His lawyer produced the real will, the one that Marcus had drafted after deciding to stage his death. This will was very different from the one that had been read at the funeral. It left the bulk of the estate to charity, to the loyal employees who had helped build the business, and to the extended family members who had remained genuinely kind to Marcus over the years without expectation of reward. Each of his 3 children would receive exactly 1 million naira, enough to be comfortable but nowhere near enough to maintain their extravagant lifestyles. The rest, including the family business, would be placed in a trust managed by independent trustees, with profits going to educational scholarships for underprivileged children. Chidi exploded. He threatened lawsuits, screamed about how much he had sacrificed for the company, how he had dedicated his life to building the business alongside his father. Marcus listened quietly, then produced the evidence of Chidi's affair with the secretary, his firing of loyal employees, his attempts to steal control of the company before his father was even buried. Each revelation was a hammer blow. Chidi had no defense. He had been caught completely, his true nature exposed in a way that left no room for denial or justification. Adana tried a different approach. She appealed to emotion, claiming that she had only wanted to honor her father with a beautiful funeral, that she had been devastated by grief and perhaps had not behaved perfectly, but surely he could understand. Marcus showed her the recordings of her planning meetings, where she had laughed about how much money she could spend from the estate, where she had complained about having to pretend to be sad. He showed her the messages where she had spread lies about her brothers, trying to position herself as the favorite child. The evidence was damning and comprehensive. Her tears dried up quickly when she realized they would have no effect. Obinna, true to form, simply asked if there was any way to negotiate. Could he contest this new will? Could he argue that his father's staging of his own death proved mental incompetence? Marcus almost smiled at his youngest son's brazenness. At least Obinna was consistent. But the answer was no. The will was ironclad, drafted by the best lawyers money could buy, and most importantly, it was Marcus's right to dispose of his property as he saw fit. He was alive, he was competent, and he had made his decision. The weeks that followed were painful for everyone involved. The story leaked to the media, as Marcus had known it would. The news of the wealthy businessman who staged his own death to test his children became a national sensation. Some praised Marcus for his creativity in exposing his children's greed. Others criticized him for his deception, arguing that no parent should test their children in such a cruel manner. The family became a subject of public ridicule. Chidi lost his position in the business and his reputation in the industry. No one wanted to work with someone who had been so thoroughly exposed as disloyal and opportunistic. Adana's social standing crumbled as her friends, most of whom were equally shallow, distanced themselves from the scandal. Obinna disappeared for a while, only to resurface months later, apparently unchanged by the experience, still looking for the next easy opportunity. Marcus moved back into his mansion, but it felt emptier than ever. The servants who had been loyal to him remained, grateful for the provisions he had made for them in his will. But his children were gone. Chidi had moved to another city, too proud to face his father or the community that had witnessed his humiliation. Adana attempted reconciliation once, a carefully worded email that managed to be both an apology and a justification for her behavior. Marcus read it, felt nothing, and deleted it. Obinna never reached out at all, which was somehow the most honest response. The business thrived under new management. The trust Marcus established funded hundreds of scholarships, sending bright young students to universities they could never have afforded otherwise. Marcus involved himself in the charitable work, finding more satisfaction in helping strangers achieve their potential than he had ever found in building wealth for children who didn't appreciate it. He began mentoring young entrepreneurs, sharing the lessons he had learned over decades of business. Some of these young people became like family to him, visiting regularly, seeking his advice, genuinely caring about his well-being rather than his wealth. On his 75th birthday, Marcus sat in his study, the same room where he had begun this elaborate test, and reflected on what he had learned. The experiment had destroyed his relationship with his children, but perhaps that relationship had been illusory to begin with, built on money rather than love, on expectation rather than respect. He had discovered that blood alone does not make a family. Character does. Integrity does. Genuine care and concern for others does. He had also learned that wealth could be both a blessing and a curse. It provided opportunities, but it also revealed the worst in people. His children had been corrupted not by poverty but by prosperity, by never having to struggle, never having to earn, never having to appreciate the value of what they had been given. He bore some responsibility for that. He had been too generous, too eager to give them everything he had never had, without realizing that the struggle itself had been what built his own character. The inheritance test had not given Marcus what he had hoped for. He had secretly wished that his children would prove him wrong, that they would show depth and character when faced with his death. Instead, they had proven every fear correct. But the test had given him something else: clarity. He knew now that the fortune he left behind would do more good in the hands of strangers than it ever would have in the hands of his children. He knew that legacy was not about bloodlines but about impact, not about what you left to your family but what you left for the world. Marcus's story spread far beyond his own city. It became a cautionary tale told in business schools and family gatherings. Parents used it to teach their children about gratitude and character. Young people used it to question their own relationships with family wealth. The tale sparked countless debates about inheritance, family obligations, and the price of prosperity. Some people condemned Marcus's methods, arguing that no parent should trick their children in such an elaborate way, that the test itself was a betrayal of trust. Others celebrated his decision, seeing it as a necessary revelation of truth, a way to strip away pretense and expose reality. But everyone agreed on one thing: the test had worked. Marcus Okonkwo had gotten exactly what he was looking for, even if what he found broke his heart. In the end, Marcus lived another decade, dying peacefully at the age of 82, surrounded not by his biological children but by the many young people he had mentored and supported over the years. His funeral, modest and genuine, was attended by hundreds who had been touched by his generosity, who had benefited from the scholarships and business opportunities his trust provided. It was a celebration of a life well lived, of money well spent, of a legacy that would endure not through bloodline but through impact. His children did not attend. They had moved on, nursing their grievances, perhaps forever bitter about what they saw as their father's betrayal. But Marcus, in his final days, expressed no regrets about the test. He had needed to know the truth, and the truth, however painful, had set him free. Free from the obligation of leaving his fortune to people who didn't deserve it. Free from the illusion that sharing blood meant sharing values. Free to ensure that everything he had built would be used to create opportunities for those who would appreciate them, who would work hard, who would pay it forward. The inheritance test had revealed shocking betrayals, exactly as Marcus had feared. But it had also revealed something else, that the truest inheritance any parent can leave is not money, but the example of how to live with integrity, purpose, and concern for others. Whether his children ever learned that lesson remained unclear. But countless others did, and perhaps that was the real inheritance Marcus Okonkwo left behind. Not millions in a bank account, but a story that would be told and retold, teaching each generation that character matters more than wealth, that integrity matters more than inheritance, and that the true measure of a life is not what you accumulate, but what you give away and to whom.